Hey everybody, hi.
Hello.
Hello, good morning. Hi.
Good morning.
I'll wake you up.
My name's Ed. I'm a UX freelancer and I'm very excited to be here today with y'all to talk about wandering the frontiers of virtual reality UX. So just a really quick blurb about me. I've been doing freelancing for the past 2 years, but before that I was a game developer for about 15, 16 years. I've worked for Electronic Arts, Pandemic Studios, Spark Limited on a number of franchises, Medal of Honor, Lord of the Rings, Sonic the Hedgehog, during that time, I spent about over a decade doing UX design for games, and just in recent years I've transitioned into doing freelancing and virtual reality. So just a quick outline for the talk today. So first off, we're going to start with a market overview of all the different VR platforms and input and what's going on with VR in 2016 and what you need to be aware of. We're going to go over VR prototyping tools that you can use to start prototype UX designs in VR. Some best practices and tips for the medium of VR and things that you need to be aware of to provide and design good user experiences. Considerations for VR user research, things you need to keep in mind when you're talking to your users. And why freelance? Why is freelancing an option that's particularly well suited to what's going on with VR right now? And then we'll talk about the future. Is what's on the horizon, VR technology, very fast moving stuff, and there's new, very exciting developments going on that would be good to be aware of. And then we'll wrap things up with a brief Q&A. So, just a quick shout out to SoCal UX Camp. I have all our awesome sponsors and partnerships here that they gave a chance out in the courtyard. Go out and say hi, and thanks to them for putting on this great talk and conference for us today. Okay, so show of hands. Who has tried VR? Okay, good. That's actually a good number of people. That's very good. So, okay. So, who owns a VR device?
Does Google Cardboard count?
Yes, cardboard absolutely counts, yes. Okay. So 1, 2, 3, that's a good amount of people. Okay. So who is working on VR right now? 1 person, 2 people, 3 people. Okay. All right. But who wants to work on VR? All right. Good. All right. I would like to think that you all want to work on VR through here. So okay. Great. Okay. All right. So how is VR UX different from your vanilla, everyday variety of user experience? So obviously it's new technology. It's new tools, new conventions. It is a new medium in and of itself. There's a lot of things that are applicable, but for all intents and purposes, there's a lot of new conventions to learn. Because of these emerging conventions, and also because the market itself is very fragmented, prototyping becomes very, very crucial for doing VR. You have to try your ideas out and get them into the headset and evaluate them. So many fundamental principles and practices of UX still do apply. Personas, user maps, journey maps, treasure maps, whatever types of maps or that type of stuff does still apply. But because VR is an artificial reality, a lot of natural input methods and real-world design thinking starts to come into play a lot more than if you were designing for mobile or for web. So let's do an overview of the VR market. So there are basically 2 parts. If you're talking about VR, you're either talking about the mobile experience or you're talking about a tethered experience, which is console or PC. So under the mobile category, you're basically talking about Google Cardboard, Samsung Gear VR. This is the Viewmaster VR, which I don't know how many people remember having Viewmaster when they were a little kid. Yeah, so it's back, Viewmaster VR is actually just a variant of Google Cardboard. There's also Daydream, which is Google's successor to Cardboard, and they're going to be incorporating motion controls with that. And then there's the tethered console experience, which is you have your PlayStation VR, you have your Oculus Rift, and you have HTC Vive, which is a collaboration between Steam, which is a PC. How many people know Steam? I've heard of Steam. No, okay, very awesome. So basically, all these hardware options present a spectrum. And on the low end, on the mobile side, you have low cost, lower visual power, and simple input fidelity. As you go to the left and get more and more towards the tethered console experience, console and PC experiences, it becomes a lot more complex in terms of the power, but also the fidelity of the input and the types of natural inputs that you can do. So with so many choices, how do you know what VR users are actually interested in? So it would not be a UX talk without cheesy Star Trek humor. Sorry, I'm a Star Trek fan, but let's talk about some data. So for 2016, this is what we know about the VR market. So you could look at this chart here. This is from Strategy Analytics. And here on the volume share, you can consider this to be hardware. And on the right value share, you can consider it to be software. So what they're projecting is that mobile platforms will make up the bulk of the hardware sales. Console-based, it's pretty much a PlayStation VR PC, which is Oculus and HTC Vive. Pretty small market. But when you look at the software side of things, the console-based stuff is predicted to drive a lot more software sales, have a much higher attach rate, and to a lesser extent PC. And I think that kind of reflects some of the general demographics about mobile users versus console or PC users. With consoles and PC, there's a much higher kind of entry point in terms of hardware and investment, but they're a much more kind of dedicated hardcore type of gamer demographic, whereas mobile tends a little bit more towards casual, free-to-play style of gaming. And I can tell you from first-hand experience, one of my clients that I'm working with right now, we're doing usability studies with 18, 14-year-old kids. The highest awareness, they're most interested in Samsung Gear VR, PlayStation VR, and Google Cardboard. So that's kind of, and I've seen other studies that corroborate this. So that's kind of what's emerging as, if you're thinking about VR, especially consumer-facing VR, this might be where you want to look into. So what are popular industries for VR development? So this is some data that I got from Getty.com. They're user experience consultancy out in the Bay Area. And so what they're indicating is that entertainment obviously is a very big driver for VR industries, what their people are anticipating in the next 2 years. But education, media, medical, high tech, VR is definitely going to transform a lot of different industries the way things are done. For example, architecture, as well as professional training is predicted to have a lot of simulations and using VR to help people learn how to do jobs better. Marketing, having kind of targeted small, short-form experiences to help promote brands is supposed to be also a lot of activity. But of course, entertainment and gaming is going to be a big portion of that. So what are VR gaming professionals working on? What platforms are they interested in? So this comes from GDC Game Developers Conference, Europe. They did a survey about that. And you can see here that as far as game developers, they're very, very interested in high-end type of hardware, the Oculus Rift, the HTC Vive, which are the most expensive platforms, but also offer the most power and the most versatility in terms of input. But you can see that your VR, the PlayStation VR, is not quite, developers aren't quite as interested in that. So, so what about outside of gaming? What about non-game VR developers? And again, this comes to us from Getty.com, and if you were to start a virtual reality project today, what platforms have the most potential? And here, Samsung and PlayStation VR, it's less than 25%. So, so what does this mean? What does this mean if you're a VR UX freelancer? What kind of opportunity does this represent? Right. So basically, it could be one of two things. If you're working in games and entertainment, there may be an opportunity to focus on these platforms because there might be a lot of developers that are not as interested in working on Gear VR and PlayStation VR. And we'll get into the reasons why that might be in a little bit. So, or it could mean as developers tend to focus on more of these high-end experiences like the HTC Vive and Oculus Rift, that they're going to create kind of these must-have type applications that people are going to want to check out, and it could drive greater consumer demand. So I just thought that was kind of some interesting data to take a look at. Okay, so the market is quite fragmented, and there's really a wide variety of input methods that all the different hardware offers. So gaze, what they call gaze, is the core interaction verb that goes across all VR platforms. So when you're looking around with your head, just like you do in real life, and you are interacting with the user interface elements, virtual user interface elements. So, but beyond that, if you look at the platforms here, it's totally fragmented. there's no standards. You know, you have all the platforms that we talked about over here. These are standard number of game pads here. Some of the platforms, they support game pads. And then look at your VR. Basic VR has 2 buttons, but then it goes up to 12. Same deal with PlayStation and Oculus. You can use like a DualShock controller or an Xbox controller. Some of them offer touchpads that you can actually, touch and do things, as well as motion controls. And thankfully, most of them do have, all of them have a microphone. So I'm hoping that we're going to see a lot more voice activation, speech recognition as an input, a natural input. And positional tracking is when you have a camera in front of it, you can kind of see where you can detect a lot of information about the user's position, where their hands are. And the Vive offers best, in my opinion, the best user experience across the board. Has anyone tried Vive? Anyone tried it? Okay, a few people. If you get a chance, try Vive. Vive is amazing. It is really, really amazing. It's the closest thing, again, Star Trek reference, it's the closest thing we're getting to the holodeck. Really, really exciting stuff. And they've deliberately gone for more of a standardized platform strategy where they don't have multiple control configurations within the platform. They're just, this is where they planted their flag. High-end market, and standardized stuff. So it's, moving along. The gamepad UX issue. So if you're going to be targeting kind of a gaming audience, one thing you need to be aware of is that, as I mentioned before, Oculus Rift, Gear VR, PlayStation VR, they all support traditional gamepads as well as kind of motion controls or other types of input methods. But in VR, you can't see your hands. You're blocked. You can't see it. So that kind of presents a little bit of a user experience issue. If you know your persona demographic is kind of a hardcore gamer type, they should have good muscle memory. This may be something that you need to do in your user research if they can't see it. Do they know where the buttons are or what to press? If you're dealing with casual audiences, too many unseen buttons might be a problem. They can't look and see like, oh, this is where the X button is, or this is where the Y button is, or whatnot. So there may be ways to get around that. You can do virtual representation in virtual reality of the controller that they can look down and they can kind of see. But at this point in time, a lot of the finger tracking device technology is not quite there yet, so you can't kind of have that, but that might be like a good affordance or reference for your users. But just something to keep in mind if you're looking to use gamepads as an input method. So, as we mentioned earlier, compared to desktop and web and mobile UX, the variability in all these platforms and all the input types and devices makes standardization really, really challenging. So you have to kind of adapt your user experience to a specific platform and persona that you're targeting. So, it can be very nerve-wracking, but there's a lot of people are basically figuring this stuff out. It's still a new medium. There's no kind of clear market standards yet. But this places a lot of emphasis on simplicity and prototyping. So, what are the tools that you can use to create virtual reality user experiences? So, basically, coming from the game development industry, the 2 main tools that are getting the most traction are Unity and Unreal. So, there is a lot of activity with 360-degree video also in VR, and I don't have as much first-hand experience with that, but if that is an area of VR that you're a part of the market that you're interested in, there are probably other tools that are better suited for doing that, for kind of making passive experiences. But for the purposes of this talk, we're going to be talking mainly about interactive experiences. So for Unity, we're going to go a little bit of pros and cons of each. Unity was geared for mobile independent development, has a very, very accessible, flexible tool set. There's a great community out there for Unity that if you've got a question, I'm using Unity every day, and you just say, how do I do this? And you're going to be bound to find answers out there. Very, very broad platform support. They've got an asset store. If you're trying to figure out how to do something, chances are somebody else has already done it, and you pay a small amount of money to go download it and install a package. But the thing to be aware of is that especially on mobile VR, performance constraints are very, very strict. It is almost like you're making games for a PlayStation 1 or a Sega Dreamcast. You're talking about hardware that is 15 years old now, because they have to render the scene twice, with lenses, and they have to render at a very high frame rate. So, and you're talking just on phone, the performance constraints are still very strict. So, and one of the things you should be aware of when using Unity is Unity's flexibility can also be a little bit of a disadvantage here, because it can allow you to kind of be sloppy in terms of creating the way you script things, the way you implement things. It might consume memory very quickly, so you have to keep an eye on your performance and your frame rate. Standard best practice is 60 frames per second. And once you start getting below that, motion sickness becomes a concern. So just be aware of that if you're starting to work with Unity. Unreal is more designed for photorealistic gaming, high-end first-person games for PC and console. It is a more mature engine architecture. Unreal has been around since the 90s. And it has a little bit more of a steeper learning curve. It doesn't have, within a certain segment, like kind of the hardcore gamer segment, or people working in professional game development for retail games, there's a lot of experience and wide familiarity with Unreal. But it does have a steeper learning curve. And in some ways, they are catching up to Unity. It does also support mobile, but because it is this sort of very powerful, muscular engine, that it has a very large memory footprint. So if you're planning on them accessing an app over the air, that may be very prohibitive for downloading because it's going to be very large. It's better for them to download, if you have an Unreal VR app on mobile, better to download it when they have Wi-Fi access. So, can you use your existing UX tools and processes? So certainly journey maps, flows, personas, all of these things are still, and even wireframes, even two-dimensional wireframes do have a place for VR UX design. But I do feel that existing tools, being two-dimensional, do tend to lend themselves to flat or rectangular experiences. And this is not inherently bad, right? We have 20 years, more than 20 years, 30 years of conventions that we've built up about how to design rectangular, flat experiences. So it is kind of a safe, comfortable, set of conventions for us to operate within. But what I feel is that it doesn't leverage VR's true strengths, which are what they call dimensionality and presence. The sense that what you're seeing in front of you is actually there. It's real, that you want to reach out and touch it. So if you have kind of this thing that just looks like a big, flat screen, or a big movie screen, I think there's a missed opportunity there. And I think as VR starts to get more and more adoption, start to figure out more of these UX conventions, you're going to start to see people move away from rectangular, flat, and you're going to start to see people embracing truly dimensional experiences. So what are these, where can we get our inspiration? What are our new / old sources of UX inspiration for this new medium? And because it's an artificial reality, look to your reality, your everyday world, for these inspirations when you want to create new or fresh user experiences. So everybody knows this image, right? Right? Everybody? Yes? Yes. Okay. So this is for design of everyday things. So obviously we don't want to design something like that, but because that wouldn't work. But the idea is think about industrial product design, about three-dimensional. You don't interact with a rectangular reality. Your reality is organic and circular. It's all around you. Automotive design, interior design, furniture design, architecture. These are, because again, it's an artificial reality, so these are, let's take our inspirations from our reality and use these to inspire us and how we're going to create exciting new user experiences. So, all right, something you need to be aware of, if you haven't heard, VR can make you sick if you're not careful. So this is, first and foremost, needs to be what you should be concerned about when you're making VR, because it plugs into your brain in a very low-level, instinctual way. A friend of mine who runs VR LA, his name is John Root. He gave a talk at a co-working space up in Santa Monica called Expert Dojo. He was on a panel talk, and he said, with VR, we have figured out the keys to the reptilian brain. So we now know how to make your brain do things on a very sub-instinctual level. And that's exciting, but it's also very powerful and maybe a little dangerous. So motion sickness is a very genuine concern, but there are guidelines that are emerging about how you can handle that, and it has a lot to do with motion design, how your camera moves and how it behaves in virtual reality, frame rate and performance, and also visual design and how the density of the visual set you're providing. So let's go in a little bit about camera motion design. This is a view frustum, the XYZ, this is how cameras move in three-dimensional space. So one of the things you don't want to do is be very careful about interrupting or interfering with gaze, because it has that one-to-one brain to hardware connection of what you're seeing and having a high frame rate. If you interfere with that, for example, if you shove it from the side, or you're like somebody's, like a traditional first-person control scheme, like in Call of Duty, that type of game is instantly going to make people nauseous. So what's happening now is that teleportation is kind of emerging as this sort of convention for how you navigate inside a virtual space. Any type of camera motion needs to feel user-initiated. You can do little things like you can shake the camera like very, very briefly, but generally speaking, be very, very careful, very, very judicious about what you're doing with the camera. Cockpits or helmet geometry can provide like a stabilizing sensation to users, can increase user comfort. Think about when you're driving in a car, you're moving at very fast speeds, but you have this kind of frame of reference around you that makes you feel like you're grounded and stable. So that can actually help quite a bit in terms of lessening the effects of motion sickness if you do have some of these kind of control schemes or camera designs where it involves a lot of high motion stuff. Fixed head / newspaper versus diegetic UI. So newspaper is kind of a term that has kind of emerged where if you have UI elements everywhere you look, like Iron Man in the Avengers movie. I don't know how this guy saves the world with all this crap on on the screen. It just looks really confusing. It looks cool, right? But it just looks really, really confusing. Diegetic UI is a term. Diegetic means coming from the world. So, for example, like if there was a radio in the room here and it was playing music, that would be a diegetic source of music. So, what we have found, what research is showing, is that head-fixed or newspaper UI doesn't always, but it may break the immersion of this feeling that you're inside this artificial reality, and it may cause discomfort if you have all this kind of distracting stuff that's blocking you trying to look around. Diegetic solutions may be more exploratory. There might be, and diegetic doesn't necessarily mean holographic. I don't want you guys to kind of think about this as like a certain visual style. You can have diegetic UI, for example. I mean, this is an example of a diegetic UI, right? Like any type of posters or billboards or projection screens. These are all diegetic types of UI. And these may be more comfortable as well as more immersive and exploratory. So, it's kind of a neat way to kind of creatively think about how you can present user information to people. And kind of going back to the architecture example, we think about when you walk into a space and where do you think that you should go? What kind of flow are you suggesting to a user inside of a virtual space? You can use that to your advantage to say, hey, we want to present this type of information to the user as they're coming into this virtual experience. Don't be a square. So when you're creating these solutions, like I mentioned earlier, think organically, think circular. Forget what you've learned about designing UI or UX for rectangles. It's margins and all that stuff. It's not as applicable. What you need to think about is high-priority information needs to be centered in the user's field of view. And what you can do is you can if there's secondary information, think about placing that into the periphery. So that will kind of create a natural curiosity. People will want to look elsewhere, and then they'll be like, okay, yeah, I need to know that, but it's not as important as what's in the middle. Again, going back to the newspaper versus the diegetic thing, this applies to both. You can certainly do some information in the periphery if you're doing like a newspaper head-fixed UI. But again, just be careful about it, and of course, research it, test it in front of your users, and see how they're reacting to it, see what they like or what they are finding is notable. Mapping virtual to the physical. So this is, when you're thinking about designing user experiences, think about the physical state that you want your users to be in. If they're going to be playing a driving simulation or something where they're supposed to be sitting down, make sure that you're thinking about, are they going to be in a swivel chair? Can they turn around and see things? Or if they're going to be in a fixed chair, because that may be less comfortable for people to try to crane their necks to, you have to kind of keep this in mind, like what are your users physically doing and what kind of feelings of comfort or discomfort does this produce. For diegetic UI, prototype and establish interaction distances and standards. Think about font sizes and legibilities at different virtual distances. This is a good thing to test out. Some of these controllers, there's this bubble of influence that you can reach out and touch things. And so you have to kind of think about when you're designing spaces, how far away information is from users and how readable it is. And again, this is why the prototyping is so important, because you just have to build stuff and get into VR and see what it's like. And one of the things also is also prompt users for their height. A standing versus a sitting experience is very different for people, but that may also kind of increase that sort of sense of connection or immersion where people feel like, because I've noticed sometimes when people try on virtual reality, they're like, wait, I'm a tall person, all of a sudden, So that might be like a nice kind of thing that you can do to promote like this sort of sense of like, this is suited to me, this is my reality now. So visual density, stylization, and immersion. So this is an image from a book called Understanding Comics that is a really fun read. It talks about the spectrum of realism to abstraction and how important that is. And although VR does feel real, it is a fragile reality. And the more realistic that it is, the more easy it is to break that reality to suddenly kind of create something disruptive. Like we talked about, obviously motion sickness, but also excessive use of these newspaper UI elements floating in front of your face. So it can be very easy to break that illusion. And you just have this kind of weird expectation that things should be reacting that behavior should be natural. They should be matching their real life expectations. And realistic styles tends to promote that kind of thinking. But oddly, what we found is that if you have an abstracted or a stylized kind of art style or visual design, those kind of expectations for realism go away, but you still have this feeling that you're inside this artificial reality. And it actually has a number of benefits as well, because it promotes better performance. We talked about having 60 frames per second being very, very crucial. But it also promotes better visual comfort, because if you have a lot of high motion things, high density surfaces, lots of high contrast noise in the look of your world, that can tend to cause like too much information overload, too much visual overload. But kind of a flat, abstracted look actually is more comfortable for users. So think about that as well.
Do you find things like the uncanny valley happening a lot with VR, with it kind of being a little disturbing to people?
Yeah, I mean, the uncanny, does everybody know what the uncanny valley is? Okay, just for people who don't know, the uncanny valley is this, the more and more that it's referring to like, there's like a Japanese study years and years ago that talked about it. It's basically, when you have like mannequins and robots, the more and more realistic that they become, they become creepy. It's like, users' potential feelings of connection to these representations, they go up, and then at a certain point they just go down. And it's like suddenly people are very freaked out about like mannequins and things like that, because they're too realistic, or there's something not quite there about them. And it happens a lot in video games and CGI movies that are very realistic. It's why cartoony style CGI movies are so popular, because they're abstract, they're exaggerated, they're kind of flat, low density. So that's a very similar principle. It's certainly very, very applicable. But that's it. I mean, I've seen some really, really amazing representations of characters in virtual reality, both realistic and abstracted, more stylized. Like they have technology where they can visually scan, both the geometry of somebody's face as well as what they look like, and you can just get so close up to them. Like we had some people visiting my client's office from France, and he had a scan of his newborn baby, and you could just like in the crib, and you could like just go look and see like the individual hairs on the baby's head. And again, going back to the whole thing about presence, like virtual reality makes you want to touch things. Like there's another thing I try to have like kind of like a CGI character in it, and I just had this is with the Vive. The Vive like lets you like with the Vive you can like kneel down and just look under tables and things, and it's just, you want it just to get, like, walk around and see the characters from all sorts of different angles. So it has this kind of weird, instinctual, there's a brain feeling thing going on. So it's going to have some very, very interesting implications for the uncanny valley, for sure. I think it's still very, very applicable. But anyway, so great question though. Thank you for bringing that up. So audio. So virtual reality is an artificial reality, so we should engage all of our senses. And I actually kind of think this is a little sad. I think that coming from web and mobile desktop design, it's usually it's a little sterile for me. It's very quiet. We don't leverage sound effects for interaction design as much, I think, as we could. And that's, I think, when you're designing for virtual reality, that's a great thing to think about, because instead of like overloading, the screen or with textual information or visual information, think about using audio. Think about even just using dialogue to inform as a feedback mechanism to tell the user things that are going on. Because again, we use our ears, we talk to people, we hear things, so this increases that sense of immersion. And sound effects are also really, really useful for promoting delightful interaction designs. I was trying this one game called Vanishing Realms on the Vive, and visually it looks like a mobile game, right? Like it's like super stylized, like super flat and stuff like that. And it's kind of like this sort of Zelda-ish kind of game where you're in a creepy dungeon and you're going around collecting gold and pick up keys and unlocking doors and stuff like that. And I picked up this key and I unlocked the door and I pulled this switch. Now, the switch could just make like a little click, it could make a little beep or something like that, but instead it was like, shh, boom, and I'm like, what the hell's going on? It's like there's something, and it just really, really put you in that moment. And because they also, a lot of these game engines, they have spatial 3D audio, the immersion is incredible, so it just, the capacity for VR to really surprise you is really, really astounding. So just think about using audio to suggest that verisimilitude or that sense of reality and to make your interactions delightful. That's what we talk about when we want in UX, right? We want to delight our users. So user research considerations for VR. So obviously comfort and motion sickness are very important. So these should be the top priorities when you're talking to your users. What did you think of this experience? How comfortable was it? You want to make sure not to be too leading about it, but so you don't introduce bias and be like, how much of this make you want to throw up? You know what I mean? So be like, yeah, so definitely think about motion sickness and comfort. Also, an interesting thing, users of Asian descent tend to statistically be genetically slightly predisposed to motion sickness. So if you're dealing with a high motion type of experience, make sure that, in your demographics that you're trying to get at least some Asians in there, people of Asian descent, for that worst case analysis. Because once you release your app, you don't know who you're going to, you do have a target market and a persona, but you're not going to be sure who's going to be trying it. So it's good to kind of always keep that sort of worst case scenario potentially in mind. And just don't assume that like, oh, it's fine. Nobody's going to throw up when they use this. Okay, so, and also you can also obtain video output from VR. This actually proves to be very challenging when you're doing user research for VR, is that you kind of have to walk people through it and ask them, what are you seeing? What are you seeing? This is how you do this, this is how you do that. There are solutions that you can use to get that video output. So if you're recording users, you can both watch them and also see what they're seeing, which can be really super helpful. More research tools also. This is a heat map. So are you familiar with heat mapping tools like Hotjar for websites or desktop experiences, mobile experiences? So we do have this for game engines and for VR, and it's an analytical tool that basically analyzes user positions. You can customize it, so you can say, what are users doing at this particular moment? Where are they looking? So you can use this to kind of assess your spatial designs and your environment designs and get information about what your users are really doing. This is currently working in Unity. Unity has the other thing I forgot to mention about Unity and Unreal, they're both free. They both have free, you don't need to pay a fee to do it. They do have kind of higher tier services, but there's a lot of information out there for you to get started with working with it. So heat mapping is as part of Unity's analytics package, and it is currently working. It's not working in Unreal, which is a little sad, because it has in past versions of the engine. We're up to Unreal Engine 4 now, and it has worked in the past on Unreal Engine 3. From what I know, it's not currently on their roadmap. I do hope they get it back into their roadmap because it's a very useful analytics and analysis tool. Okay, so why should you consider VR UX freelancing? So how many people freelancing, by the way? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so is everybody else full time? Yes, pretty much. Okay, so freelancing right now. VR experiences are tending towards short-form experiences, kind of like a 15-minute experience. We're still trying to figure it out. How can we engage users for longer sessions for comfort? People are still trying to figure that out. So the projects that are being made for now tend to be short projects. They tend to be over in a couple months. So, so if you can handle the volatility of freelancing, you can work on a variety of projects and you can get experience very fast. So I've been doing freelancing just for 2 years after being full-time for 15 years. And I've worked on probably 5 or 6 VR projects in that time. And you get to work on different platforms, different end user types, different industries. It's really a way to level yourself up as an expert very quickly. And the conventions are moving so fast. And being freelance allows you to be agile. And you can work on something for a couple months and then move on to something else and learn something new. Again, the volatility is really tough. I can attest from firsthand experience. It's really, really tough. Dealing with the volatility and not knowing where your next paycheck is coming from, but it can be worth it. So, what's coming down the line? Augmented and mixed reality is something that's also on the horizon. Oculus was purchased by Facebook, so I've heard that they are partnering up with Microsoft so that you'll be able to use Oculus on Microsoft's Xbox. Microsoft is also developing HoloLens, which is a augmented reality solution where it mixes the video that you're seeing and it places artificial objects inside what you're seeing. You can actually do that with the Gear VR headset because it does include a camera. So you can also prototype some augmented reality things with Gear VR. There's also going to be more progress with natural tactile devices, with using more fidelity with what your fingers are specifically doing. The Oculus Rift has, if you buy it now, it comes with a gamepad, but they have like this they're going to be rolling out like an optional touch controller that has kind of a ring around it, like a plastic ring, and it can sense your fingers. And I've also heard about other glove-type devices. You guys all remember the Power Glove back in the 80s at Nintendo, right? You thought that was the coolest thing ever. Well, it's going to come back. VR is not a new idea. It's been predicted in films and literature, sci-fi for many, many years. But you're going to be seeing more stuff with gloves. One thing I'm kind of excited about is I've heard about gloves that actually have motors on the back of each finger. And what they can do is that you can reach out and touch something, and it will pull back on your fingers when you're touching something in virtual reality, so you feel like that it's real. That's actually has a physical form. So I'm really excited to try stuff like that. Magic Leap is also another hardware augmented reality solution that's coming down the pipe. It's basically like a pair of glasses that is wired to a smartphone-like device, but it doesn't actually have a touch screen. And it's supposed to be able to just do really, really amazing things where it draws artificial things on top of your own reality. So there's some and there's a lot of money being invested in Magic Leap. So I would keep an eye on that. Apple, nobody knows what Apple is doing for VR. Nobody knows, as far as I know. But they're going to be coming at some point. And when they do, it'll be huge. I think that they're going to be waiting for like the Gear VR, PlayStation VR, they're going to be waiting for the first movers to make their move, and then they're going to see what happens in the marketplace, and then you're going to see Apple jump in. And recently, there's also been some rumors that Nintendo, with their new hardware platform, the Nintendo NX, might have some sort of virtual reality component. So it's supposed to be this kind of a tablet-like device that has controls on the side. You can then detach the controls and then put the tablet into a dock that connects to your TV. So you can play games both on the go and also at home. But there's supposed to be there might be some virtual reality component to that. So we'll wait and see. So if you're interested, we're getting close to the end of the talk here. So if you're interested in keeping up to date on virtual reality and user experience, If you haven't had a chance to sign the sign-in sheet, that would be great. You can also, if you do a quick tweet to talk about this talk, using hashtags SoCal UX Camp, and my handle, AmpedUX, that's the name of my consultancy. Feel free to follow me on Twitter, and you can also go to my website. I have a newsletter where I'll be sending out, links to about newest stuff that's happening in VR and UX and stuff. So I'll leave that up here for a second. But at this point, we could move on to a Q&A.
So I just wanted to mention another resource if people are interested in the Unity. There's a really good Unity 3D LA meetup group.
Oh, yeah.
And it's a great group.
Do you know Grant?
Yeah.
Yeah. Grant's an old friend of mine. So Grant Vickland, he runs the LA Unity meetup. There's also an Orange County Unity meetup. Adam Tuliper is his name. He's a product evangelist, I think, from Microsoft. He runs the Orange County one, and Grant Vickland runs the Los Angeles one. So and you'll get to network and meet all sorts of professional developers there of all levels, hobbyists, professionals, independents. That's a great resource. Thank you for bringing that up. If you're interested in learning more about Unity development. So.
Do you find any kind of haptic feedback will help to minimize like motion sickness? Kind of feeling some of the forces that you would have felt, say you were actually piloting something, or if say someone actually like pushed you. So kind of give your body the sense of the actual jarring motion other than just the look of the jarring motion.
I think haptic feedback kind of can again help that sense of reality or presence. When you touch something, just that sort of physical confirmation that you've interacted with something successfully, or that absence of it to kind of give you that feedback. I don't think it really has any immediate impact on motion sickness that I can think of. Because again, motion sickness is more about the visuals and your head moving versus haptics, which is kind of vibrating things and motors and controllers. So I can't think of anything immediately that might, it could be like if you have a simulator chair, like, I've seen some really great VR experiences where they have these chairs, these rumbling chairs underneath you, or chairs that can move and stuff like that. That can help kind of increase that sense of immersion. But it's a number of things that you have to keep in mind to minimize motion sickness.
So I've done a bit of research into neuroscience for all this, and I was actually at VR LA yesterday, and I was saying something like 60%. So 40% less neurons are firing when you're in a VR environment. Now imagine when you're doing that all the time, maybe more than 10 minutes, 15 minutes. Are you worried about the guidelines that will, either government or something like that will kind of narrow what you can and can't do, or what do you think about that?
Right, so the question is, are there concerns about guidelines, like legislative or government guidelines about health concerns about being in VR for too long? Is that correct?
Yeah.
Summary? That's certainly going to be a concern. All the hardware manufacturers, they do say users under a certain age should not use VR because their eyes are still developing. But I will say that kids are really interested in VR. So, and I've, just from first-hand observations, I've seen kids come in and use VR for 15 minutes at a time or longer and not be really adversely affected. But since it's a new medium, I think there are going to be long-term studies about that. So again, it's still one of those things that's kind of emerging. I will say that sometimes what I've found myself, if I've been using VR too much or I'm in a very intense VR experience and after I take it off, you have this sort of weirdly disassociated feeling from your real reality because you've been like spending, you're in like, a Vive experience where you're teleporting around and you can look under tables and suddenly you come back into real reality and suddenly you're like, whoa, why is this desk in front of me? So yeah, I do think that is a genuine potential concern, and it will, as time goes on, I think you're going to see a lot more kind of exploration with that. But that's kind of what the manufacturers are recommending for now. And most of the experiences are short form, but I do think that longer form VR experiences are coming.
Okay, so I'm handicapped, my ears and my eyes. What are they doing on the UX end to adjust for certain physical conditions that might actually limit the VR experience?
Okay. So what are they doing for accessibility, for making sure that VR is accessible for people with disabilities? Okay. So I think that it depends. That's kind of a tough question to answer. I do think that what you can do for color blindness is you can kind of make sure that, that's one thing that would still apply, color theory, and making sure that, you're using, for UI elements, that you're using color so that people can distinguish between things effectively and doing some of that testing there. But aside from that, I mean, I would say it would really, kind of going back to the question about haptics, is kind of also thinking about, using haptics for feedback when you're confirming things. I mean, I think it would be tough for people who are significantly visually impaired to enjoy VR because the human brain most of it is for visual processing, and VR is obviously highly visual, so I don't know if there's kind of an immediate solution for people with visual impairments. Most VR headsets are large enough to keep your glasses on inside, so, I would think even if people have partial vision or can't see things stereoscopically, you can still kind of have that feeling kind of being connected in VR. But I think the thing that VR is great about, I think, is it has this potential to give people who have impairments or disabilities accessibility to experiences that they could never do in real life. They can go hang gliding, they can go, windsurfing, they can go under the water, and I think, and the thing that VR is very powerful too is also kind of an empathy builder. VR can literally put you in the shoes of other people. So I think that's the power of VR, is to have that sort of deep, immersive, transformative qualities.
Have you experienced for gameplay? I remember reading a study a while back. So say you're playing a game that's almost like, not like a survival horror, but just a survival game. I've heard that actually having you in a VR situation makes you a lot less likely to take risks that you say normally would have done if you were just looking at a computer screen.
Yeah, absolutely. Because you're no longer, there's this cognitive separation between you and the screen, or even the movie screen when you're watching a movie, that it's still safe somewhat. Virtual reality takes over that. So it's much more deeply immersing. So again, it's like you have to kind of think about, there's some people out there who are going to love horror experiences in VR, and they love being scared because it is. I mean, like I said earlier, just the thing with like just pulling the lever and hearing that noise in spatial audio, like creep the hell out of me, and it's just a sound, so I think that, yeah, you're going to have, for gaming, there's going to be some people who are going to be really into that, and some people that are going to be really scared by that. So it just depends on knowing your audience and what type of product that you're going to make for them.
So you said about movement in VR should always be initiated by the user, or it helps in avoiding motion.
It helps.
But a lot of time in taking games, you have a lot of motion that is because of some elements in the game, like if you're flying a plane or you're moving in space because it's on slow or something.
Sure.
So is there ways in which you can get around avoiding motion sickness for motion that is not initiated by the user? Because there's also a new thing like where roller coasters are using VR for enhancing the experience, so that's not a user-initiated motion.
Yeah.
So what is like the thought process behind that?
Okay, so the question is, what can you do to mitigate user motion or motion in a game or a simulation where the camera motion is not initiated by the user? So earlier I mentioned that you can use cockpits if it's appropriate, like cockpit geometry, like inside a car or a spaceship or something like that. That kind of, some sort of consistent visual frame kind of reduces that. The visual density of things also helps if you kind of make things more stylized or flat, but it still feels dimensional. So you still feel like, you literally feel like you're inside a video game, So those are things you can also do. There's also, they found that if you're using a third-person camera versus a third-person camera, so instead of seeing something from somebody's eyes, you're looking at like a character on the screen that's moving independently of where you're looking, that can actually also address motion sickness. It's actually, in some ways, it can be more effective. So if you have, like, for example, if a character's on a platform or some other elevator or moving object, that might be something that you could do to help address that. It might even be like you go step inside an elevator and you kind of wait with a third-person camera. So it could even enhance kind of the cinematic quality a little bit of it. That's, you sort of feel like, oh, you're looking at it from a different view, So the idea is to kind of don't assume that the things that work in video games and other media work in VR, and work within those design constraints that VR affords you, because I think that'll result in a better user experience. So,
Do you ever see VR stepping outside of that gaming or media consumption
Oh, yeah.
group that it's kind of been dominating? Like, what kind of applications do you see outside of those categories?
So the question is, what kind of applications are going to be outside of UI? Outside of gaming for VR? Lots of stuff. So a friend of mine I was speaking to, this is just anecdotal, it's not based on any concrete data, but he said the top 3 industries that are benefiting from investment. Number 1 is architecture. Number 2 is professional training and simulations, and number 3 is gaming. But again, as I mentioned earlier, I've also seen a lot of activity in product marketing and creating these sort of companion experiences that are driving people towards brands. So a lot of it is very geared towards gaming because VR is kind of like this sort of step cousin to gaming because the technology is shared, but it's really a lot more than that. So I think that there's, I think it's just my 2 cents. Those I think where the highest potential lies for creating VR.
And there's another interesting one, which is actually designing physical products. So it's like if you send it to someone, you say, okay, the repairman, can he fix this? And he puts on a VR set and you can prototype it and you can see, okay, can I get my hand around to grab whatever it is to replace it? Or I can't in this case. So there's a lot of stuff you can do there that you would be surprised.
Yeah, absolutely. One of the Vive experiences, if anybody gets a chance to try a Vive, there's a Vive experience by Google called Tilt Brush, and it's literally you can paint in 3D. Like you can sign your name in neon or flame, and you can walk around it and see your name in 3 dimensions. But what I've seen people do, they have like different backgrounds or scenes that you can load up, and one of them is like a mannequin, but a very kind of abstract one where it's just kind of the head and the torso. And you can use that for fashion design. You can like literally paint strips of fabric on top of the mannequin. And just imagine, and you can just undo it or change the colors or do whatever you want, you know. So it's just, it's really going to be very transformative. I think once the technology comes down in price, people start to get their handle on conventions and things like that. I think it's just going to be really, really exciting. So.
I've just had a question about AR, augmented reality, and how, what the difference is between fundamental user experience. I know it's a bit only just because it's cool, but do you see much different in terms of developing and designing it?
Yeah, I think a lot of some of the concerns about augmented reality kind of for virtual reality go away with augmented reality, because augmented reality is about taking what you're already seeing and adding new elements to it. So usually you're only kind of rendering objects that are in front of you or displaying some information about them. So there's not there's so much of this sort of takeover of your brain that happens with VR. So they're predicting that augmented reality is going to be an even bigger industry than virtual reality. So I think that is something certainly to keep in mind. You know, you're already seeing it with Snapchat. And all of the funny filters that people can do on your faces and blending your face with somebody else, that's augmented reality. So I think that's, Pokemon Go is augmented reality, you know? So I think that it's already here, and I think that some of these concerns, some apply, but, like the newspaper thing, not overloading users with information, that's just good UX no matter what you're working on, right? We got like 5 more minutes, so.
Have you seen any projects in development in terms of social interaction in VR? So like not necessarily like multiplayer games, but I don't know, like VR Facebook or something.
VR Facebook. Well, I think that Facebook. The question is.
Let's forget Facebook. I'm talking about 2 people connecting via VR as opposed to you are just interacting with the virtual reality.
Sure. There's one, actually a friend of mine that used to work at Pandemic Studios, he has a company up in Seattle called Against Gravity. And they work on a product called Rec Room. And it is gaming, but it's social gaming. So it's like basically people playing, like paintball or, ping pong. And it's using the Vive, so it has a very high degree of accuracy with where people's hands are, where their heads are and stuff. But people are playing charades in VR. And it has like a tilt brush style functionality where you can kind of paint something in the middle of the air, and you see people dancing and stuff in VR because they can see their hands, and it's actually really surprising that you can get that sort of, even just from a two kind of hand controllers and a headset, you can kind of get that subtlety and expression. So, so there's that. There's I saw a demo just the other day of somebody showing off playing board games in VR, and you can kind of switch their games up from being like a like a chess game to other different types of board games, and that's designed for people to kind of interact with each other. In terms of like just pure socialization, I think anything's possible for sure. I think it's just you can have people getting together and having virtual meetings. They're sharing information. I mean, I think that it's wide open, like what can be done with this medium. So I think there's no reason that there would be a constraint on having those type of just purely social experiences. I mean, you can have a microphone, you can talk to each other, you could change the way that the mouth opens depending on the audio input from another user. I mean, it's going to go wild places. It's going to be cool. So, yeah. Any other questions? Comments? Okay. Awesome. Thanks, guys.